We just got our first look at Duskmourn House of Horror, and it looks absolutely awesome. It's an upcoming standard set that doesn't launch until September, but we already know a decent amount about it, so let's talk about everything you should know. First off, let's talk about the setting and the themes of the set. Duskmourn House of Horror takes place on a brand new plane, that being its namesake, Duskmourn. The plane, however, is a little weird because it's one large mansion, meaning the entire set and plane takes place within a single building. You can see this in the really cool new full art basic lands, which show various rooms of the mansion in a very cool style. This mansion helps to amplify the set's theme of modern horror. Unlike Innistrad, which aims to do horror in a more gothic way with vampires, werewolves, and more, Duskmourn takes a more creepy approach with jump scares, fear, and modern horror movie tropes. And you can really see that on a card like Nowhere to Run, which is a 2-cost black enchantment with flash that when it enters gives target creature an opponent controls -3/-3 until end of turn, and then it makes it so creatures your opponents control can be targeted as though they didn't have hexproof, and it makes ward abilities not trigger. I think this card is actually really cool. It's removal on an enchantment in black, which we don't get too often, and it kind of deals with the hexproof and ward problem it feels like the game's been having recently. Within Duskmourn, there's also a bunch of treatments you can find on cards that also kind of have this modern horror theme to them. For example, you can find the paranormal frame here on Chainsaw, another new card. This card itself is a 2-cost red equipment that when it enters deals 3 damage to a creature, so it's removal right away, and then whenever creatures are dying, you put rev counters on the Chainsaw, and then it gives +X/+O, where X is the number of rev counters on it, although the equip cost is kind of high at 3 mana. But despite that, it is still removal right away, so I do think the card is actually pretty decent. Another treatment is the Mere Monster Borderless treatment, which is supposed to, quote, center the subjects of horror with the house. As you can see here on Screaming Nemesis, a 3-cost red 3/3 with haste that whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target, and if a player is dealt damage this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. This is a card that's hard to block, hard to attack into, and is backbreaking for life gain decks. Another card in that same style is Doomsday Excruciator, a card that costs 6 black mana. It's a 6/6 with flying that when it enters, if it was cast, it exiles all but the bottom 6 cards of each player's library, and then it draws you an extra card at the beginning of your upkeep. The 6 black mana required to cast this card makes it pretty difficult to cast, but it wouldn't shock me if there's some deck that can make it work and turn it into a win almost every time. Another treatment we have is the double exposure treatment, as we can see here on Toby. Toby itself is a 3-cost 1/1 that creates a 4/4 that can't attack or block alone when it enters, and then it gives flying to all your tokens as long as you control 4 or more creature tokens. The card itself actually seems pretty good. Getting a 1/1 and a 4/4 for 3 mana is a pretty good rate, even if the 4/4 has some restrictions on attacking and blocking. If you're gonna have a token deck, it'll almost always be able to attack and block with something else. And this card also gives your tokens flying, making it even easier to attack. Another interesting thing is that double exposure treatment is also available in textured foil, as you can see here with the Wandering Rescuer. This is what it looks like in the normal double exposure, and then this is it in textured foil. It actually dramatically changes the look of the card. In terms of what it does, it's a 5-cost white 3/4 with flash and convoke, and then it has double strike and gives other tapped creatures you control hexproof. I actually really like this card because it kind of is a free protection spell for your creatures, since you can tap them to convoke out the Wandering Rescuer, which when it enters will give them hexproof, and so it's a way that you can kind of throw off your opponents if you have no untapped mana. Another treatment is the Japanese Showcase style, which is actually not going to be unique to Duskmourn. They're going to do this for most sets going forward, and so they're picking about 10 cards per set to put in this Japanese Showcase style that can be found in both English and Japanese in collector boosters. For example, Overlord of the Hauntwoods is a 5-cost green 6/5 with Impending 4 for 3 mana, and we'll talk about that in a second, and then whenever it enters or attacks, you create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type. Impending is a brand new mechanic from the set, and it kind of is like Suspend, but instead of going into exile and casting it a number of turns later equal to that number, it goes onto the battlefield as an enchantment, or I should say not as a creature, and then that many turns later it becomes a creature. So here, if you pay 3 mana, it comes in as an enchantment, you get the Enters ability, and then 4 turns later it becomes a creature, and you can start attacking with it to make even more lands. We also know that Delirium is going to be a major mechanic of the set, as shown on Fear of Missing Out, which is a 2-cost red 2/3 that when it enters, you discard a card and then draw a card, and then whenever it attacks for the first time each turn, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you untap target creature, and then after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Delirium is what we call an ability word, where on every single card it's going to look a little different, and it's not just one set mechanic. The big thing is that any card that has Delirium will care about there being 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, often unlocking new abilities on permanents or boosting them up. Another mechanic we know about is rooms. We don't know how it works mechanically, but we know that there's going to be a mechanic that represents rooms, and every time they showed art for a room, it had 2 different names, implying that it's some sort of split card. Also, all of the art has something in the middle that divides 2 different looking locations, so that could imply moving between rooms or something like that. Another thing we learned is that Collected Company is getting reprinted as a special guest, so this won't affect the legality of it, but it is a nice reprint to see that you'll find in play boosters and collector collector boosters, and it'll sometimes show up in limited. Another thing we know is that there's going to be a new cycle of Leylines, for example, Leyline of Hope, which is a 4-cost white enchantment, which just like other Leylines, if it's in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield, and it makes it so if you would gain life, you gain that much life +1, and if you're at least 7 more life than your starting life total, it gives creatures you control +2/+2. This Leyline's a little bit more niche than a lot of the other Leylines we see. Normally they're pretty generic effects that any deck could want, but this is very clearly going only in life gain decks, and I think in those life gain decks, it's pretty good. We also learned about the commander precons for the set. There are going to be 4 of them. There's a white, blue, and black miracle top of the library manipulation deck. There's a black, green reanimator deck. There's a blue, green instance and face down deck, and there's a black, red unconfirmed strategy deck that seems to be burn or group slug or something in that nature. Similar to March of the Machines Plane Chase and Outlaws of Thunder Junction's bounties, these decks also come with some bonus cards to change how you play commander. This time it's Archenemy, a returning format that a lot of people love, but we haven't gotten new cards for in quite some time since Archenemy Nico Bolas. So yeah, there's going to be 10 in each deck, and so that's pretty cool to see. For example, we have I Will Savor Your Agony. We're not going to talk too much about how the rules of Archenemy work in this video, but if you want me to do an explainer video on that, let me know in the comments below. We also got a couple other cards that I want to talk about. For example, Twitching Doll, which is the buy a box promo, is a 2-cost green artifact creature spider toy 2/2 that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color, and then you put a nest counter on it, and then you can tap and sacrifice it to create a 2/2 green spider with reach for each counter on Twitching Doll, but you can only do that as a sorcery. What I really like about this is that you can just use it as a mana dork that gets these counters over time, and then eventually sacrifice it when you don't need mana to make a bunch of spiders, but it doesn't actually care if they are nest counters. They can be any type of counter, so they could be +1/+1, they could be vigilance, they could be death touch. Any way you can get counters on this, you can then sacrifice it to make a bunch of spiders, which seems really cool, and it seems like a lot of decks are going to want this, especially if you're in a counters theme. We also have Come Back Wrong, which is a 3-cost black sorcery that destroys target creature, and then if a creature is put into a graveyard this way, you return it to the battlefield under your control, but you have to sacrifice it at the beginning of your next end step. So you can use this as a normal removal spell, and if you kill something with an Enter the Battlefield ability or a Dies trigger, you get to then get that by putting it on your side of the battlefield and then sacrificing it later. Also, if your deck cares about sacrificing things, or you have a sacrifice outlet that generates you value, you can obviously do that, but you can also use it on your own stuff. If you have a card with a really good Dies ability, you can use this to get that ability, bring it back, sacrifice it again, and now you get that ability twice. It just seems like a versatile card that can do just a ton of different things. And the last major card they spoiled was Enduring Tenacity, a 4-cost black 4/3 enchantment creature that whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, which is really powerful in life gain decks, but then when it dies, if it was a creature, you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it's an enchantment, meaning it's no longer a creature. This is a really interesting card, because it's obviously very good in life gain decks, but the way it's templated makes it very weird, because normally if you take a very good effect and put it on a creature, that's considered a downside, because it makes it more vulnerable. But here it actually isn't more vulnerable. You get to take advantage of the fact that it is a body, and then eventually it's going to die, and it's going to come back as an enchantment that does that same thing. It's actually more protected, because if someone has an enchantment removal spell, they have to kill it as a creature that's also an enchantment, and then it comes back as an enchantment that they then have to kill again. So it's kind of weird where you're getting all the upsides of it being an effect on a creature without a lot of the downsides. The last thing I want to talk about is actually not a card, but instead a product. They have this thing called the Nightmare Bundle, which the box looks really cool, and it reminds me a lot of the complete bundle from Phyrexia All Will Be One. Instead of the normal 9 play boosters that you get 6 play boosters and 2 collector boosters, and then you get this thing they're calling a Nightmare Booster, which contains a stylized movie poster promo card, one of 3 of them, and then it has one of 3 spine-tingling borderless promo cards, plus 3 double-sided movie posters featuring promo card art. That is directly from the site because we really don't know that much else about it, but it's currently going for about $78, and it's something I'd keep an eye on because those complete boosters were pretty cool from Phyrexia All Will Be One, and this seems like it'll be pretty similar. Either way, those are the big things you need to know about Duskmourn House of Horror. It seems like a pretty cool set, although we do have a couple between now and then before it actually releases, but I want to know your thoughts about it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, and if you want to see more from me, check out one of these 2 videos that YouTube is recommending just for you.